We often hear of filmmaking as a collaborative endeavor. After all, movies can involve hundreds, if not thousands of people. Actors, craft services, lighting technicians, visual effects artists, sound people, engineers, drivers, writers, cinematographers, producers, the director, and so on. But at the top of the heap is the director, the one whose vision is emblazoned across the film. Different directors have their own style. Kevin Smith's films are relaxed, Ron Howard's are optimistic, and David Lean's were a well-oiled machine. But then there are directors that have a, for lack of a better word, reputation. A reputation as assholes, that is. Some directors are dictators behind the scenes and push their actors to the brink. In this video, I want to take a look at these real dictators, and the actors that suffered under them. But before talking about 3 directors legendary for their tyrannical nature on set, I think it's worth asking ourselves, is it necessary for directors to be so harsh? Does it actually make the movie any better? Directors like Stanley Kubrick, James Cameron, and David Fincher were, and are, known for their intensity on set and their commitment to getting the right shots. Kubrick and Fincher are known for their innumerable takes, while Cameron is known for making the whole damn environment something like a safety hazard in order to pull the viewer into the movie. But that perfection does come at a cost. Their directing styles have led to actors breaking down in tears, spending more time than they anticipated on a movie, and suffering injuries or breakdowns. Some will argue that they get results. The dictator directors, the Alfred Hitchcocks, the Charlie Chaplins, the Francis Ford Coppolas, the Kubricks, the Camerons, the Herzogs, and on, are also hailed as the greatest filmmakers of all time. Each of them have made some of the finest films ever made. Stanley Kubrick's filmography is pretty much a list of greatest hits movies. Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, 2001: Space Odyssey, The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, and so on. James Cameron has movies like The Abyss, Titanic, and Avatar. Francis Ford Coppola has movies like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, and so on. But many of these are movies that took severe tolls on their actors. The Shining had Shelley Duvall crying herself dry every day for months during hellish 16-hour shoots 6 days a week. The Abyss almost killed James Cameron and was nicknamed The Abuse. Werner Herzog had a Peruvian tribe haul a 320-ton steamship up a hill 4 Fitzcarraldo, a production that also had actual tribal warfare. These are all directors that have a my way or the highway approach. The actor is to follow the director's orders, and while some improvisation may be allowed, it's certainly not encouraged. In fact, it might be best if the actor just not think at all and simply follow the director's instructions. Alfred Hitchcock once said that, quote, actors should be treated like cattle, end quote, and some directors take that to heart, driving their talent whip in hand before the camera. Their movies are hailed as some of the greatest ever made, to be sure. But is such treatment necessary or even worth it? Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, the Coen brothers, and Ron Howard have all been described as easy to work with. Sure, movies like Jaws and Silence might have been difficult shoots, but that's more because of the conditions surrounding the films as opposed to Spielberg or Scorsese's directorial style. Each of these directors have also made some exceptional movies. E.T., Jurassic Park, The Departed, No Country for Old Men, Apollo 13, and others are all excellent, beloved films, and none of them required the director pushing their cast and crew to the brink of insanity. While their actors might disagree with the director on character choices, at no point was the actor subjected to wildly uncomfortable conditions. James Cameron, famously dictatorial, once described what he found on a Ron Howard set. He was surprised by how kindly and respectfully Howard treated his crew, taking time to compliment them and talk to them. In his words, quote, I could have listened more. I could have been less autocratic. I could have not made the movie more important than the human interaction of the crew, end quote. He described himself as a tin pot dictator, and that now he tries to find, quote, my inner Ron Howard, end quote. So Cameron, at least, doesn't think it's necessary to be autocratic to get a good performance out of people, at least not anymore. The question is, in a way, unanswerable. You only get to make a movie once, and once it's done, it's done. We can't make The Abyss the James Cameron way and the Ron Howard way and see which is better. But we can take a look at what some directors put their actors through. James Cameron is, without a doubt, one of the most important directors in film history. The man has 3 of the 5 highest-grossing films of all time, and each of his last 3 movies have made more than $2 billion at the box office. It's correct to say that no one has cracked the Hollywood code better than James Cameron, but that kind of success does not come easy. Cameron has also been known as one of the hardest driving directors in Hollywood. While he won't demand as many takes as Stanley Kubrick does, he will nonetheless run actors ragged by putting them under extreme conditions. That's what separates Kubrick from Cameron. Kubrick's sets were intense, but not extreme. Yes, the hours were long. Yes, you would have to do many takes. Yes, Kubrick would talk your ear off. Cameron's sets seem like a different story. The hours will be long, so they have that in common. But instead of just having the director against you, it would seem that though the entire physical set would be against you. Many of Cameron's most storied films are elemental, and that element has most often been water. The Abyss and Titanic are two of the hardest productions in film history, while movies like Avatar were difficult because of the completely different movie magic that actors had to navigate. Filming on the water is hard enough, but with The Abyss, James Cameron had to film in the water. A nuclear reactor was converted into a giant tank where the cast and crew would sometimes spend hours submerged at depths of up to 50 feet. They had safety divers called angels with them on their dives to make sure that everyone made it through to the other side. But there were plenty of moments when that wasn't always a sure thing. One was when James Cameron almost drowned. They all used oxygen tanks to be able to breathe underwater, and one day Cameron's tank ran out of oxygen. It was dark at the bottom, and he was wearing more than 100 pounds of gear to help him walk along the base of the reactor. He discarded what he could and started his ascent. When a safety diver saw him, he rushed over to help and ended up making everything worse. He gave Cameron his backup regulator, which was broken. Instead of giving Cameron air, he gave him water. When Cameron made it to the top, he fired his safety diver and his assistant director, who was supposed to be keeping track of Cameron's oxygen levels. I will say this about Cameron: he was hard on others, but he was as hard on himself. Lead actor Ed Harris fared no better. He almost drowned a couple of times as well. The first was when he had to swim along the bottom without a suit, and a safety diver took their sweet time giving him a breathing regulator. But the second time was the most harrowing. It happened when Harris begins his descent into the abyss. His helmet was filled with fluid as he was towed down. In Harris's words, quote, "The worst moments for me were being towed with the fluid rushing up my nose and my eyes swelling up. Once, the regulator was put in upside down so that one half of what was going into my lungs was water. For a brief second, I thought, this is it, before Al swam over and put the regulator in right," end quote. Later that evening, Harris understandably broke down and cried. His co-star, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, fared no better. Towards the end, there's a scene where her character has taken in water and is comatose. Harris needs to revive her. In his words, he was, quote, "screaming at her to come back and wake up, and I was slapping her across the face, and I see that they've run out of film in the camera. There's a light on the camera, and nobody had said anything. And Mary Elizabeth stood up and said, 'We're not animals,' and walked off the set. They were going to just let me keep slapping her around," end quote. When she walked off, she stayed off for a while. Harris had to finish the scene by himself, screaming into thin air. Meanwhile, Michael Biehn, who had worked with Cameron 2 times prior as Kyle Reese in Terminator and Hicks in Aliens, had his own harrowing experience. In a New York Times article, Biehn describes being weighted to the bottom of the water tank. In his words, quote, "There were weights on our ankles and waist. If something went wrong, we couldn't swim to safety," end quote. Then, quote, "Once we lost all power, it went completely black," end quote. It took him a minute to realize that he had a flashlight, so he was able to get some light back, but it's understandable why he thought that that might be it. Cameron later said, quote, "I knew this was going to be a hard shoot, but even I had no idea how hard. I don't ever want to go through this again," end quote. His next movie was Titanic, so maybe he didn't learn much, because that was another hell of an experience. This is the one that Cameron wanted to get perfect. The reality was that even the pre-production on Titanic could be deadly. Cameron wanted to get as close to a 1-to-1 replica of the historic wreck as possible, which meant that he needed to make multiple dives to the Titanic wreck. Any flaw in the sub would result in certain death, something that he was aware of. Again, Cameron put himself through as much as he would put his crew through, and he put his crew through a lot. This is how the Times put it, quote, "The making of Titanic cemented Cameron's formidable reputation as the scariest man in Hollywood," end quote, and that, quote, "he became known as an uncompromising, hard-charging perfectionist," end quote. Cameron was hard-driving, but considering the size of the production, it was somewhat understandable. In Cameron's words, quote, "Filmmaking is war, a great battle between business and aesthetics," end quote. And like in war, some people got hurt when making Titanic. People came down with the flu, kidney infections, broken bones, chipped bones, and more. Kate Winslet had it particularly bad. Winslet, just 22 at the time, took some private umbrage with Cameron's directing style. In one scene, when her and DiCaprio are trying to escape some water through a gate, her dress got snagged on it and pulled her underwater. In her words, quote, "I had no breath left. I thought I'd burst, and Jim just said, 'Okay, let's go again.' That was his attitude. I didn't want to be a wimp, so I didn't complain," end quote. And after spending so much time in the cold water, she also contracted hypothermia. Keep in mind that there was a lot of water rushing in and making sets collapse. The fact that people got injured isn't a surprise, but the fact that nobody died is a miracle. The end result was a masterpiece. The one word that Stanley Kubrick is most associated with is perfection. He was one of the most, if not the most, exacting directors that the film industry would ever see. He would do take after take after take after take and put his actors through the grinder in order to get the exact performance that he desired. Cecil B. DeMille, also a dictatorial director, only took 117 days to shoot 1956's biblical epic, The Ten Commandments. I don't think he could handle the 400-day shoot of Eyes Wide Shut. Both were real dictators, but Kubrick was more dictatorial. The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut, rightfully, get the most recognition for his grueling takes, but it all began in his late 20s and early 30s, especially on movies like 1957's Paths of Glory and 1960's Spartacus. Paths of Glory starred Kirk Douglas, one of the biggest actors in the world, and several other men that were double Kubrick's age. But Kubrick was already an obsessive at this point, and despite only having directed a few small independent movies prior, he felt comfortable making demands of veteran actors that had been working longer than he'd been alive. The man that really felt the brunt was Adolphe Menjou, 38 years Kubrick's senior. According to Kirk Douglas, Kubrick made Menjou do a scene 17 times. Menjou thought that he'd given it his all and thought that they should take a break for lunch. Alas, he did not know who or what he was dealing with. Kubrick ordered another scene which sent Menjou into a fury, during which he complained about Kubrick's birth and the fact that he was a kid pretending to be a director. Kubrick listened quietly, let Menjou run his mouth, and then said, quote, "Alright, let's try the scene once more," end quote. Menjou, defeated, obeyed. So, when Kirk Douglas wanted Kubrick to direct Spartacus, he knew exactly what he was getting himself into. At this point, Douglas was one of the most bankable and powerful men in Hollywood. But he also knew real talent when he saw it. After epic director David Lean declined and Anthony Mann didn't work out, Douglas hired Kubrick, who was just 30 at the time. This is what Douglas said in an interview, quote, "In my book, I called him a shit, which I think he is, but he's a very, very talented guy. I divorce one from the other. You don't have to be a nice guy to be a talented guy," end quote. And Douglas knew talent when he saw it. Both were men that desired power and control over their pictures and exerted it when they could. One of Kubrick's clashes was with cinematographer Russell Meddy, who'd worked with Orson Welles and Howard Hawks prior. Kubrick was very specific with how he wanted scenes lit and shot. While cinematographers try to help a director achieve their vision, they also have some freedom of camera and lens choice, lighting, and shot setup. Meddy threatened Edward Mule, president of Universal Pictures, that if Kubrick kept behaving this way, he would quit the movie. Kubrick responded by telling Meddy, 22 years his senior, quote, "You can do your job by sitting in your chair and shutting up. I'll be the director of photography," end quote. Meddy would win his only Academy Award for cinematography for Spartacus. Then he clashed with Dalton Trumbo, the screenwriter. Trumbo, who had been blacklisted, was brought on by Kirk Douglas to write the script for Spartacus, a move that would break the Hollywood blacklist. He sent a script that they were able to work with, but Douglas, Kubrick, and Howard Fast, who wrote the Spartacus novel, would rework it to suit their needs. According to Douglas, Kubrick had a, quote, "healthy ego. He infuriates you at first, then you settle down and admire him," end quote. The Shining is probably the movie that he really started getting a reputation for being a dictator on set. It was a long, difficult year-long shoot with a script that kept changing by the day, sometimes by the hour. Eventually, Jack Nicholson would even stop trying to memorize his lines because he knew that they would probably change. The cast and crew would film for up to 16 hours a day, up to 6 days a week for months on end. Kubrick was a very methodical director. Nothing was done without a purpose, but things that were done to the maximum. While the 100-take rumors are sometimes overblown, Kubrick did, in fact, demand multiple takes. He blamed it on the actors, saying, quote, "It happens when actors are unprepared. You cannot act without knowing dialogue. If actors have to think about the words, they can't work on the emotion. So you end up doing 30 takes of something, and still you can see the concentration in their eyes. They don't know their lines. So you just shoot it and hope you can get something out of it in pieces," end quote. That, at least in Kubrick's opinion, was true for The Shining. For example, the scene where Shelley Duvall swings her bat at Jack Nicholson was, according to rumors, done 127 times. That's unlikely to be true, but it was still likely to have been done over several dozen takes. In the scene, you get a sense of the panic and exhaustion that she's feeling. Perhaps that's what Kubrick was talking about when he said that actors can't work on the emotion if they're thinking about the role. The more tired they are, the more natural they are. Duvall, according to rumors, had it the worst. Certainly, she would not deny that he was a dictator. In her words, quote, "Kubrick doesn't print anything until at least the 35th take. 35 takes, running and crying and carrying a little boy, it gets hard. And full performance from the first rehearsal, that's difficult, end quote. Certainly that leaves an impact. It's hard to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and Duvall would sometimes have to cry until she literally could not cry anymore. But that was for the performance. According to Duvall, behind the scenes, Kubrick was, quote, very warm and very friendly to me. He spent a lot of time with Jack and me. He just wanted to sit down and talk for hours while the crew waited, end quote. He just became a different person when the cameras were rolling. Meanwhile, Eyes Wide Shut had a famously long shoot going to 400 days. Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman had initially only signed on for 6 months. They obviously had no idea what they were getting themselves into. As with The Shining, the script kept being rewritten, and, as with The Shining, he kept them doing take upon take upon take upon take until they were able to act as though there was no camera. There's a rumor that he made Tom Cruise walk through a door more than 90 times before he was satisfied. Cruise and Kidman, for their part, have never complained about Kubrick, though perhaps they had reason to. Kubrick forbade Cruise from being on set for several days, during which he filmed a scene where Kidman's character has sex with another man. He also forbade her from discussing it with him. That was his way of getting the right jealous reaction from Tom Cruise. Kubrick's perfectionism also took a transatlantic flavor for the movie. He was afraid of flying, but he also needed to replicate Greenwich Village in England. So, quote, he sent a designer to New York to measure the exact width of the streets and the distance between newspaper vending machines, end quote. I guess perfectionism isn't really the right word here. Obsession is more accurate. But that obsession is also what led to so many masterpieces from a singular director. David Fincher's perfectionism takes more of a Kubrickian form than a Cameronian form. The man loves his takes, loves them. He doesn't break his actors down psychologically like Kubrick does, nor are his sets elementally painful like they can be for Cameron. Rather, Fincher is all about the takes. In his opinion, if the money is already spent and the actors are already there, you might as well get it perfect. In an interview for Zodiac, he also said, quote, I hate earnestness in performance. Usually by take 17, the earnestness is gone, end quote. Some of the takes seem excessive for small things. For example, in Gone Girl, he had Ben Affleck do 50 takes of him smiling in front of a missing poster, and just having him try different shades of a smile. Meanwhile, the introduction to The Social Network required close to 100 takes. According to a New York Times article for Zodiac, Mark Ruffalo, Robert Downey Jr., and Jake Gyllenhaal, quote, endured multiple takes of 70 shots and beyond, end quote. And, according to a Ringer article, quote, while directors usually average fewer than 10 takes but may get up to around 15, Fincher operates in a range between 25 and 65. There are times when he goes over 100, end quote. Most of his actors are willing to go along, but some aren't as kind in their appraisal of Fincher. Arlie Ermey, who played Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, also appeared in Seven. Of Fincher, Ermey said, quote, he's afraid to take chances. He's afraid to let anybody change one word in the script. He wants puppets. He doesn't want actors that are creative, end quote. Fincher also clashed with Ed Norton, though that might have more to do with Norton's propensity to try and take over a movie for himself. It is worth remembering that, as filming and editing are non-linear, that doesn't mean that he needs a perfect take. It's more the case that he'll take bits and pieces from each take and then stitch them together in the editing process to come up with what he considers the right take. Fincher, like Kubrick and Cameron, isn't particularly collaborative. The director is at the top of the pyramid, which is something that Robert Downey Jr. seemed to agree with, saying, quote, sometimes it's really hard because it might not feel collaborative, but ultimately, filmmaking is a director's medium, end quote. Ruffalo agreed, adding, quote, he knows that this will outlive him, and he's not trying to settle for anything other than satisfaction, deep satisfaction. Somewhere along the line, he said, I will not settle for less, end quote. And when it comes to perfectionism among directors, that's the big thing. They refuse to settle for less. A shot must be perfect and exact in their minds because once it's on the screen, it will remain there forever. Sure, you might get a George Lucas who decides to go back and edit his works, but most directors only ever include shots that were cut from the film in the form of an extended release, or let the film stand on its own the way that they envisioned it. But once it's out there, it's out there. It's impossible to get the genie back in the bottle, and some have tried. Kubrick even tried to burn the negatives of Fear and Desire, his directorial debut, because it didn't turn out the way that he wanted it to. He even tried to dissociate himself from a masterpiece like Spartacus because he didn't have final cut. Directors can often be their own worst critics, and that's most true for the directors that are as harsh on themselves as they are on others. The question that remains to be answered is that harshness at all necessary? That I'll leave you to decide. What do you think? Do directors need to be dictators in order to make an excellent movie?